For more analysis, we have with us Matthew Sussex. He's a visiting fellow from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Matthew, the US, they're saying this reeks of desperation. What is most revealing about this in terms of Putin's war effort in Ukraine?
Well, it's an interesting question. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, was in Pyongyang about 2 months ago, seeking a similar type of deal. And it seems that Kim Jong-un has said, well, we can discuss this, but I want FaceTime with Vladimir Putin. And the fact that Putin is prepared to allow this, I think, is quite significant in terms of how much Moscow needs North Korean help. And particularly, the help it needs is artillery ammunition. The Russians have been firing through an enormous amount of artillery shells. The Ukrainians, about 12 million last year and about 7 million this year. And with domestic production really only at about 2.5 million shells per annum, there's a massive shortfall that it needs to make up if it is to have the hope of continuing to prosecute this war for the foreseeable future.
Matthew, given that the USSR had a strong influence and the Korean People's Army was largely shaped in the Soviet image, does it mean that there might be fewer issues with integrating North Korean-made weapons that Putin wants?
Yes, that's right. The North Korean war stocks are basically identical to older Russian ones. I think it's not so much things like, tanks and fighting vehicles that the Russians are after. It's more ammunition. And that can be produced relatively simply, provided that you have access to, high explosive and you have factories that can produce this. And North Korea has that in significant abundance, the capacity to crank out large amounts of ammunition, which ultimately is what the Russians need first and foremost.
Okay, so Putin wants the ammunition and the artillery. What does North Korea want from Russia that Moscow would be willing to give?
Yeah, well, look, I think North Korea is actually unusually, the DPRK is in the box seat here when it comes to negotiations, because there are very few other countries that Putin can source what he needs from other than North Korea. Iran is one, but it can't make up the shortfall, and China has said no. So I think what North Korea will ask for is access to high-end technology that can be used for military purposes, in addition to probably a hefty amount of cash as well. It's the second thing there, of course, that is most worrying, because that would potentially have applications for the DPRK's submarine program, its cruise missile program, and potentially even its nuclear program too.
And food as well, because North Korea does have a food security issue, don't they, Matthew?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, those would be the obvious non-negotiables, that food and funding that it would ask Moscow for, and would doubtless receive that. But you'd think that under the circumstances, Kim Jong-un might be tempted to push his luck a little further and see what he can extract from Russia in terms of the ability to modernize the North Korean military.
And what role does China have to play in this? Because some analysts are saying that North Korea will only act strictly according to what has been agreed upon with Beijing. Is there any truth to this?
Well, I mean, it depends who you believe as is having influence over North Korea. North Korea itself is famously resistant to pressure, international pressure, whether it comes from the West, whether it comes from Russia, and frankly, whether it comes from the Chinese as well. There have been times in the past when Beijing has cut off the aid tap to Pyongyang, and the North Koreans have simply ignored it. I think perhaps the biggest story to come out of this is perhaps less related to, how Beijing reacts, and more the fact that this is effectively a coming out party, should it come to fruition, for North Korea, given that Russia has been a participant in UN Security Council sanctions against that regime for its nuclear testing, and that would really set a dangerous precedent that then other countries like China might be tempted to follow.
Matthew, we have time for one last question. What would be the consequences and implications for the war in Ukraine if indeed this deal were to pan out and Russia gets what it wants from North Korea?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it would give the Russian armed forces the ability to sustain their defense against the Ukrainian counteroffensive, pretty much for the foreseeable future. One of the things that the Russian military doctrine has relied on, whether they're advancing or whether they're trying to prevent counteroffensives, is the use of a lot of artillery fire. The fact that the Ukrainians have been advancing relatively slowly in its own counteroffensive is thanks partly to the Russian defenses that have been constructed over 6 months or so, with tank traps and mines and trenches and so on, but also because when Ukrainian forces have been spotted, even in small number, the Russians have rained an enormous amount of artillery fire down on them. The ability to source this ammunition from the North Koreans, would give the Russian armed forces the ability to sustain that for a while, which could potentially hold up the Ukrainians a little further.
Matthew, squeezing in one last question, if you don't mind. Washington threatening more sanctions if an arms deal does happen, but how effective are sanctions really? Is this the way to go?
Yeah, look, I mean, sanctions are highly effective in some areas and highly ineffective in others. In terms of political pressure on the elite that surrounds Vladimir Putin, very little influence whatsoever, you'd think. Things like travel bans and so forth are regarded in Russia kind of as a badge of honor, if not a kind of loyalty test. Where it does put pressure on the economy is, I think, in areas where Russian consumers don't have access to things that otherwise they would normally have. A good example here is, aviation spare parts, with the Russian domestic fleet not being able to be serviced by Boeing and Airbus, which is where the majority of their planes come from. They have to cannibalize those planes in order to keep a few of them flying. And so it's those types of targeted sanctions that can, I think, have an effect. And I think if you're in the United States, you're also thinking potentially about whether there are sanctions that can be brought to bear on other nations that trade with Russia in order to help its war effort, which could also have an effect too.
All right, Matthew, thank you very much for your insights. That was Matthew Sussex, visiting fellow at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University.